Welcome, everyone. I'm Ryan Stubbs, Senior Director of Research at NASA. Thanks for joining us today. I wanted just to make a few brief comments before we get started with the presentation and discussion. Over the years, we've seen state arts agencies take different approaches to assessing and evaluating their grant programs. More recently, these assessments have been done with what I think is an evolved and more nuanced understanding of equity while maintaining foundational efforts to reach underserved communities and serve the entirety of their states. Now, in NASAA's work, we see consistent evidence of state arts agencies investing resources in underserved communities and across all geographies, but there's so much more to explore in these areas. Considerations for state arts agencies go beyond needing to evaluate the outcomes of specific programs on targeted populations, because there is an imperative for public agencies to serve the entirety of their often complex jurisdictions. And this makes evaluating outcomes especially difficult. However, a number of state arts agencies have taken sophisticated data-driven approaches using both qualitative and quantitative data to better understand their reach and their ability to serve communities and to implement change, and seeing how that change is implemented and then evaluating it from there. And today we're going to hear from 3 of those states. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to Moja Rhodes to introduce our speakers and start our program. Moja?
Hello, everyone. My name is Moja Rhodes. I'm the research manager at NASAA, and this is a very exciting topic as it relates to taking stock of one of the most important activities SAAs engage in, and that is grant making. I'm excited to be here, and I'm excited to hear about these initiatives and projects, a few of which I have contributed to. So for the first part of this session, we will be hearing from the Illinois Arts Council, the California Arts Council, and the Minnesota Arts Board on their programs and initiatives. The second part of this session, we will engage in some prepared questions, and then we'll get into some questions from the audience. Our first presentation is from the Illinois Arts Council. Let me introduce to you, if you don't already know, Joshua Davis Ruperto, Executive Director, and Encarnacion Teruel, Deputy Director. Our second presentation is from the California Arts Council, and with us is Josie Miller, Programs Manager, and John Carnwath from the consultant Wolf Brown. And representing the Minnesota Arts Board, we have with us Sue Jens, Executive Director. So without further ado, let us begin with Illinois.
Thank you, Moja. Appreciate it so much. Let me just get into presenter mode. Great. Hey, everyone. For those of you that I don't know, my name is Joshua Davis Ruperto. I'm the Executive Director of the Illinois Arts Council, and I am joined by my colleague Encarnacion Teruel, Deputy Director. And thanks for letting us talk a little bit about the work that we're doing here in Illinois. So this all started just over a year ago, after 40 years on the board and 33 years as our board chair. Shirley Madigan stepped down and Governor Pritzker appointed Nora Daly as our new board chair. Nora has been a champion for the arts in Chicago for years. She's served in board leadership for After School Matters, Terra Foundation. She's the former chair of the City of Chicago Cultural Advisory Council, as well as the former chair of Steppenwolf Theater. When she arrived, we immediately began discussing where the agency was and what challenges we were currently facing. As the Illinois Arts Council nears its 60th anniversary, and with this new energized leadership, it seemed like a perfect opportunity to reevaluate programming impact through an equity lens. How could we get Illinois where it needed to be and better serve all constituents and not just a select few? So we knew that before we began implementing major change, we needed data to back it up. And we did this in a couple of different ways. The first was we embarked on a listening tour around the state to learn more about how our funding could better serve the field. What are the challenges? What are the opportunities that people were seeing? And the realities for the sector after the global pandemic. Over a 6-month period, we held 34 town hall meetings in over 20 different counties. They were attended by well over 200 organizations throughout the state, as well as individual artists, state legislators, and local government officials. Some meetings were as small as a circle of 30 people talking about revitalizing their Main Street. Others were packed auditoriums. Now, this may not be new for many of you, but here in Illinois, travel had been limited and at times not allowed. We had a 3-year budget impasse where we had no budget other than staff salaries and federal dollars. So when that ended, we were barely getting our feet underneath us when the pandemic hit. So many of these communities that we visited, we hadn't been there in well over 10 years. But we do plan to continue these listening tours as part of our new ongoing work throughout the state. And in tandem, we also invested in a collaborative research effort with the National Assembly of State Arts Agencies to examine the Illinois Arts Council's grant-making through an equity lens. This was called the Equitable Grant-Making Assessment Initiative, or EGAIN for short. And it was inspired by the work that the NASAA did with Ohio. This was designed to identify funding gaps and recommend strategies that the agency could pursue to reduce barriers for organizations to receive support. To start this work, we looked specifically at the following under-resourced communities to ensure equity: rural areas throughout the state, areas with high poverty levels, BIPOC-led businesses, and organizations that focus on serving the disability community. So the report analyzed the demographic distribution of our general operating support awards. It also engaged constituents in providing feedback about their needs, experiences, and perceptions. It identified equity strengths and weaknesses in IAC's approach to general operating support, and laid out recommendations for actions we could take towards greater grant-making equity in the future. This in turn served as evidence-based data that the Arts Council could use as talking points with the governor and the legislature during the budget season. The full EGAIN report, which is broken down into 5 smaller reports, is included on our website. And I think we'll post it in the chat in case anybody wants to access that. So here's some of the major issues that we found here in Illinois. There are disparities in the share of grant funds going to rural versus urban counties. The agency, Illinois is kind of unique in the aspect that a lot of times people look at us as Chicago and the rest of the state. And for so long, we focused on making sure that the majority of our funds weren't landing just in Chicago, that we forgot to look at urban and rural. And that's something that we have to own up to. We really left our rural partnerships behind. We did find that though we fund significantly more small and mid-sized organizations than most other states, our grant sizes tend to be much smaller in size, with our largest grants being in the $55,000 region. The application process could be overwhelming and considered not worth the effort by a lot of the small and volunteer-run organizations that we serve. And we had just too many grant programs that had been created throughout the years, and it was starting to confuse people. Another thing that we learned, which was a bit of a surprise for me, was that communities in Illinois tended to identify themselves by geographic location most, which we realized we needed to address that in our grant making as well. So that's one of the shifts that we made. And we realized that the data that we had been collecting for years that we thought was going to be useful whenever we got around to actually utilizing it was not useful data. It was not data that we could rely on. And that was a bit of a disappointment, but it was a great first step to realizing what we needed to do to get the correct data and better serve the state in the future. So I'll get into a few of the charts that are represented in the report. This one's going a little bit further. Here's a chart that identifies basically the disparities between urban and rural communities. This chart shows that though 14% of the population here in Illinois currently resides in rural parts of the state, only 5.5% of IAC dollars were making their way into those communities. This chart here, you can see that during the 7 years studied in this assessment, the majority of grant dollars went to small and mid-sized organizations. In fact, 70% of our dollars were going to organizations with operating budgets below $500,000. And we fund through general operating support upwards of 850 organizations in a given year. This chart here this is information we knew, but the extent of it was kind of surprising. The report in the report, NASA compared our grant making to other states of similar size and budgets. And within those states, we received a chart of arts organizations with budgets over $30 million and the amount of support that they received from those states. I'm sure some of you may recognize these organizations on this list. Of the 19 arts organizations that were listed, 8 of them came from Illinois. However, the total support that we offered for all of those 8 institutions combined is still nearly $200,000 less than what Donna in Ohio is giving to the Cleveland Museum of Arts alone. So we're still looking at what that means for us, but it is a great argument in relation to a larger budget for us moving forward. Now I'm going to hand it over to E, and we're going to talk a little bit about the changes that are currently being made based on this data.
Thanks, Josh. So I'm briefly going to discuss what we're doing with that information. Prior to opening the session right now, we were talking about how this is budget season for many of our fellow state arts agencies, as well as for the Arts Council. We just went through that process. The governor just went through that process last night. So the first thing we were trying to do is we were working on obtaining a larger budget, and we'll talk about that later in the presentation. We realigned the staff so they were more regionally focused with intentional focused outreach to local communities. We simplified the multi-year cycle application that collects data only useful in our decision making or that is useful for analysis of the sector as a whole. In other words, we realized, as Josh mentioned, that the data that we were collecting really wasn't useful in terms of telling us anything. So we've restructured what we're asking for in the application process. We also created a smaller suite of programs, and we are creating a more equitable funding formula for distribution of general operating supporting funds. We've created a simpler review process, moved into a reader mode rather than a panel mode for reviewing applications. And we're developing a new initiative called the Illinois Creative Collaborative. Let's start with the Illinois Creative Collaborative. Through this initiative, the IAC will build an intra-agency partnership to increase visibility of funding opportunities available to the Illinois creative sector through the state of Illinois. Sister agencies such as Tourism, Department of Commerce and Economic Opportunity, Illinois Criminal Justice Information Authority, and the Capital Development Board will come together to discuss funding opportunities available to our constituents. Illinois invests hundreds of millions of dollars in our sector, but many are unaware of the opportunities that are offered statewide. So the Arts Council will work with the Creative Collaborative to create kind of a clearinghouse of funding opportunities for artists, and then publicize those and make those available, that information available to the creative sector. We're also working with our advocacy group, Arts Alliance Illinois, to create a help desk for navigating these opportunities, which can be a bit cumbersome. And we will also continue to pursue additional relationships with federal agencies, private foundations, and service organizations to expand awareness of Illinois funding opportunities. These opportunities will be found on our website, sent through emails, featured on our social media, and listed in our newsletter, which is all a new initiative with the Arts Council in terms of communications with our state constituents. I'm going to pass back to Josh to wrap it up.
Sure, thanks, E. So one of the other things that we did was an organizational restructuring of the agency. We hired a director of strategic partnerships, so it was going to be kind of overseeing that creative collaborative initiative. As E mentioned, we haven't had a communications team in 15 years, believe it or not, here at the Arts Council. So we've hired a director of communications and a communications coordinator that's been working on telling our good story, which is really wonderful. We created a director of programs position. That person can oversee all of the changes that are going to be implemented in the upcoming fiscal year in relation to our grant making. And then, of course, the regional-based program directors that we had discussed earlier. This is the way that we're breaking down our state. It was decided in relation to county lines, workload, and kind of what made sense for Illinois as a whole. Each one of my program directors will take one of these regions of the state, and then the Chicago metro region is also being divided into 5 smaller regions. So each director will have a large region of the state and a small portion of Chicago as well. We're basically getting rid of disciplines as a whole. Everything is going to be viewed from this perspective. And that is so that we can build relationships, better understand kind of what partnerships are happening, and understand those arts ecosystems throughout the state. So let's talk a little bit about current successes that have already come from this, which I'm really excited about. This literally happened yesterday, so you're getting a little inside scoop. But I gave quite a few presentations about the work that we've been doing, the really great partnership we had with NASAA. And because of that, the governor agreed that we really needed to focus on getting some additional resources. It was a very difficult year in Illinois. A lot of agencies received cuts. We saw some difficult decisions being made, but we ended up receiving an increase of $8.3 million. And so that is going to be signed by the governor, hopefully at the beginning of next week. So we're very excited about that. And then also, what else got passed is this Creative Economy Task Force. So this is an initiative that we were working with Arts Alliance Illinois on, and basically Department of Commerce and Economic Opportunity and myself will spearhead a task force to create a strategic plan for the creative sector as a whole moving forward with the state. And that's going to be done over a 3-year period. There's no funding tied to it yet, of course, but we're hoping to resolve that in veto session. So we're working on that right now. But we're really excited to make those announcements. And that's pretty much all I have right now. So I'll hand it back to Moja.
Thank you so much, Joshua and E. Thank you very much again. And so now we'll move on to California.
Awesome. Well, good afternoon, everyone. I am Josie Miller, one of the arts programs managers with the CAC. Happy to be zooming into you today from the unceded lands of the Nisenan, Miwok, Maidu, and Papua-Winton peoples in what we now call Sacramento, California. Thank you to John Carnwith, who is sharing screen for our deck. I'm just going to give us a quick little tee up here and then let John really get into the details of the work that we've been doing in California for the past couple of years. So really for us, the catalyzing event was the 2019 adoption by our council of our 7-year strategic framework. And in that framework, not only did the council reiterate our commitment to strengthening arts, culture, and creative practice as tools to benefit all people in California, to your point, Ryan, that's our charge as state arts agencies. But the strategic framework really centered racial equity as a foundational and organizing principle for how we are committing to do that work. So upon the adoption of that, we recognized we had some gaps in our understanding about how we were actually going to, through a lens of race equity, reach the 40 million people that we are tasked with benefiting. So John, if you'll hop to the next slide. We basically immediately commissioned a comprehensive grant-making evaluation. The request for proposals indicated the objectives that you see on your screen, really helping us understand how we are doing the work that we need to do to benefit all people, again, through a race equity lens. So in terms of the deliverables, we were looking for 3 things. First was a field scan, just understanding what nonprofit arts organizations in our state are out there. Again, it's a state of 165,000 square miles and incredibly diverse geographies. And a comprehensive field scan had not been done in over a decade. So we really recognized we needed to understand what orgs were out there, what they were doing, and how they were comprised. The 2 other deliverables were a business process evaluation and a theory of change. Really, we're going to be focusing on the field scan today, but I will pop the link to the evaluation webpage in the chat in case anybody is interested in those other docs. And with that, John, I'm going to pop to you to get to the meat of it.
Great, thank you, Josie. So as Josie mentioned, we're going to be focusing today on the field scan. And I think just to kind of explain, there's obviously going to be there's a lot of similarities to the work that was happening in Illinois, but I think was a little bit different with this project was that we weren't just looking at California Arts Council's funding, we were looking at it within the context of the larger field of the total population of organizations that are out there and of other funders that are supporting the arts ecosystem. But I think there are some really interesting parallels and intersections with the previous conversation. To start off with, I'm going to talk a little bit about the methodologies and data sources before getting into a couple of the key findings. To start, I want to say that this was a partnership between Wolf Brown, the firm that I work with, and Scansion, and we collaboratively worked on all of these components of the evaluation project. So for the field scan, we brought together both quantitative and qualitative data. Pulling on the quantitative side from all of the largest and most robust data sets on the nonprofit arts that are out there, and work to stitch those data sets together at the organizational level. And here I should also mention we were working with NASA, and it was really the NASA research team that did all the heavy lifting on the data aggregation and pulling that together so that we'd have in one database all of the data on each of the organization, from Candid on the major grants they've received, all of the data arts data, all of the data on CAC grants they've received, and so forth. And then, however, even while we were drawing on all these big data sets, we realized that all of those data sets have their own biases. And we know that they're incomplete, and that there are certain types of organizations and artistic practices and people that are less likely to show up in those data sets. So to hear from people who aren't applying for grants and who aren't reporting to the IRS, or maybe even don't even have a bank account, we selected 3 sites: Fresno, South LA, and Imperial County in Southern California, where we would conduct a deeper qualitative research to provide windows into the different community settings in those locations, and help us hear from some of the people that we wouldn't otherwise be hearing from. In each of those communities, we worked with a local artist who then connected us to other people in their kind of arts environment. So to their peers, to other organizations that they're connected with. And we specifically chose people who are kind of on the fringe of the nonprofit sector. So not necessarily formally incorporated organizations, but kind of informal artist collectives and so forth, to gain an understanding of how those people are supporting their creative practices. All right, so this is getting a little bit into the weeds here, but I think it's important, and that is, for this analysis, we wanted to look at racial equity specifically. And in order to do that and to see where funds are going and where they're not going, we need to be able to identify organizations that are serving BIPOC communities and ones that aren't. And that isn't data that's systemically collected within those data sets that I mentioned, the census data, the data arts, and so forth. So what we needed to do is come up with a way of identifying those organizations that are BIPOC-centered. And I want to be very clear about that term that we're using, saying that they're BIPOC-centered organizations, because we actually don't have data on who is leading those organizations or who is actually attending those organizations. What we are doing is we're talking about organizations that have the primary mission of serving or representing communities of color. And the way that we went about identifying those organizations, and again, when I'm saying we, NASA did a lot of the heavy lifting here, the way we went about that was basically searching in the names and in the mission statements for a long list. I think it was over 300 different search terms for specific cultural practices, for ethnicities, racial identities, and so forth, and tagged all of those organizations, and then went through and cross-validated those tagging schemes with membership lists that we had of existing, say, networks of Latino organizations where we knew all of those organizations are serving Latino communities, so we could kind of cross-reference to check our work, and then ultimately check the accuracy, and found that that tagging scheme, while it wasn't perfect, was 87% to 92% accurate in identifying those organizations that really were in their primary mission, serving or representing communities of color. That said, I also want to highlight that doesn't mean, of course, that the other organizations aren't also supporting communities of color. There are many organizations where that isn't their primary mission, and they are serving big populations in significant ways and meaningful ways. But this is the kind of way we went about the tagging to identify those inequities in access to funding. So I just want to highlight that here. And so what we arrived at by aggregating all of the data from these various sources was a database of 13,774 nonprofit arts organizations, of which we tagged 18% as being BIPOC-centered organizations. And as this kind of secondary lens for equity analysis, we also looked at rural organizations, which were 9% in our database. I also just want to note, because I think it's an important observation, that 67% of the organizations in this data set have annual budgets under $50,000. So those are really small organizations. I mean, at that level, you're not even talking about like one full-time paid staff member, most likely. So these are primarily volunteer, and that's 67, 2/3 of the entire population of arts organizations that are operating at that level. I just, that had already been shown in previous research, but I'm just always struck by that figure. And now I'm going to get into a couple of the key findings. The report you can access on the link that Josie has posted, and you can get into more details there, but I just want to touch on a couple points here. So perhaps not surprisingly, one of the key findings is that nonprofits are not evenly distributed across the state. And again, I want to emphasize this is just the distribution of the nonprofits themselves. This isn't yet looking at where the funding is going, just where the organizations are. And what you see on this map here is a dot distribution where each dot represents a nonprofit. The orange dots are BIPOC-centered organizations, and the blue are other arts organizations. And we see that without getting into a lot of details, certain areas have a lot more nonprofits per capita than others, meaning that even if the resources were distributed evenly among the 13,000 arts nonprofits, we still wouldn't actually be serving the state's population in an equitable manner. The network in which that we're funding into has gaps and holes, so that network itself isn't reaching into the population equitably. Our qualitative research also emphasized the importance of those informal organizations, the artist collectives, the small businesses that are kind of rooted in their communities and also providing opportunities to be creative, to experience the arts in their small business settings. And those aren't even captured in this data set. And oftentimes those informal organizations or small businesses or what we were referring to as community enterprises, those are often filling in the gaps in this network of nonprofits across the state. And that's what we found when we went into Fresno and into Imperial County and had those conversations with people, is really how significant those organizations are. So I think the takeaway here is if you're just paying attention to the arts nonprofits, you're missing a lot of the places and people who enrich the lives of Californians with arts and cultural meaning. Okay, the second key finding is something that really came through vividly in our outreach for the community consultations in these 3 locations. And for those, just as a visual description of the slide, there are 3 pictures. One is a sculpture in the desert in Imperial County. A second is a jazz performance at the World Stage in Leimert Park in South Los Angeles. And the third is a mural in Fresno. And what we realized in reaching out in these communities is that some of parts of the sector are very well organized and highly structured. And there are contact lists that you can easily reach out to. If I wanted to get in touch with all of the executive directors of the theater companies in the Bay Area, I could do that by tomorrow without much difficulty. But in other contexts, there's just a lot less infrastructure available. And we're not necessarily, in reaching out to people, viewed as a trusted resource or important source of funding. We're just a kind of unknown entity reaching out to them. And that's particularly true of either organizations that have never encountered the California Arts Council before, or have perhaps even had a negative experience applying for grants repeatedly and not receiving funding. And after a couple tries, you know, when they call you on the phone and are asking for input, they're not so eager to pick up the phone. So the takeaway here is that it's really about building those relationships and building trust, and that if we want to serve the field equitably, we can't kind of put out the grant announcements, you know, through one set of channels and expect that people are going to respond to those calls equitably across the state. It's going to take a lot more effort to actually get funds into the pockets that have historically been underfunded. All right, the third finding, and there's just one more after this. So our analysis shows that foundation grants disproportionately go to urban and nonprofit organizations. And here I'm talking about the funding, not just the distribution of organizations, but the foundation grants tend to go to urban and non-BIPOC organizations. And of all of the funding streams, donations from individual donors were actually the least equitable in terms of the proportion that goes into rural areas and to BIPOC-centered organizations. So they were even more inequitable than foundations. And a big part of why that's happening is that the resources are concentrated in a small number of organizations, of the major arts institutions, that are located in urban areas and that aren't specifically serving BIPOC populations. So there are 108 arts nonprofits with budgets over 10 million in California. That's less than 1% of the arts nonprofits in the state. And those organizations receive 70% of the total resources that go to the arts. 50% of all arts grants from private foundations go to those 108 organizations. And 73% of all donations from private individuals go to those organizations. So almost 3/4 of the donations from private individuals go to those 108 organizations. So what you're seeing, just to explain on this graph here, is the total budget of the organizations. So that's the total resources that they have available on an annual basis for all of the organizations above $5 million on this slide. So already this is, as I mentioned, 2/3 have budgets under $50,000. So this is already, even these very tiny ones on this chart are $5 million organizations. And the purple bars, those are the budgets of BIPOC-centered organizations. And you just see that there aren't many BIPOC-centered organizations in those budget categories where the vast majority of the resources are going. Now, there's nothing inherently negative about having well-resourced large institutions that serve large numbers of people. But fundamentally, it's the concentration of those resources in those organizations that is driving a lot of the inequity in the state overall, in the state's overall ecosystem. Now, the good news is that CAC's grants offset some of that concentration in the largest organizations. Just 6% of CAC's grants go to those largest 108 organizations. And to wrap up here with my portion of the presentation, the fourth finding, the key takeaway here is that CAC's grants are also reaching more BIPOC-centered and rural organizations than funds from other sources. Whereas BIPOC-centered organizations represent 18% of the arts nonprofits in California, they're receiving 31% of the grant funds that CAC distributes. For rural organizations, the difference is a little smaller, but they're still receiving a slightly higher than their proportionate share of CAC funds. Now, the problem with this, and also on the previous slide, is that CAC's annual budget was $25 million in the period that we examined. And while they received some one-time funding allocations in 2021 and 22, their total budget really pales in comparison to the resources that the private foundations distribute each year, which is around $670 million. And the data suggests that California's arts nonprofits may receive twice that amount from individual donors, bringing the total philanthropic contributions from private sources to around $2 billion. So when CAC is giving out $25 million, even if those 25 million, 100% went to BIPOC serving small organizations, that wouldn't even almost correct for the imbalance in the distribution of resources. So given that the distribution of the private funds, we can't really expect to right the ship with through direct grant making, which means that either CAC just has to accept that it and kind of right size its expectations for influencing the overall distribution of resources, or it has to consider whether it can in some way indirectly influence the flow of the private resources, really where the vast amount of resources is, to channel those into more equitable distribution patterns. So I'm going to leave it there and turn it back over to Josie to bring us home.
Great, thanks so much, John. And I'm aware of time, so I'll keep this brief. But just in terms of how we are utilizing these findings in action at the CAC now, there are many examples, but just to hit on a big one is our decision support tool, which was drafted as part of our strategic framework and has been finessed and really evolved by our phenomenal race and equity manager, Megan Morgan. And what the DST is it is a tool for our council members to walk through a series of about 20 questions that examine what the impacts of a particular action would be through an equity lens. And there are, again, 20 or so questions examining everything from who's benefiting, is there enough staff support, is there enough funding? But one of the questions is, has research been done to support this action in a race equity context? And so really, above all, what the field scan was able to do was provide our council members that data to be able to look at and say, hey, if we fund this grant program, or we put this restriction or this priority on, how is that responding to what we now actually know are the needs in the field? And with that, I'll toss it back to you, Moja.
Thank you so much, Josie and John. Thank you very much for that presentation. And our final presentation will be Sue Jens from Minnesota.
Great. Thank you so much, Moja. I want to make sure that we have time for questions. So I think I'm just going to touch lightly on a few things that I wanted to share. This is for those of you who were Monty Python fans, this is the Now for Something Completely Different presentation. I really admire the work that's been done in Illinois and California, really large research initiatives to rethink the agencies in some profound ways. Our approach here in Minnesota is different than that. You might call it 1,000 points of light approach. We have tried to build in evaluation and research on an ongoing basis, so lots of littles, and tried to use that to guide how we're investing dollars, and then ultimately how we make the case and how we talk about our work. So just a little bit of background, if you don't know Minnesota well, my job before I got to the Arts Board was working at a public policy teaching and research institution, so kind of grounded in that idea about what is public investment and what does it do. So when I got here 20 years ago, we started commissioning some research questions on public perceptions of the arts, participation, and the degree to which Minnesotans valued the arts in their daily lives. It was very rudimentary, very simple, but it was a place to start. 15 years ago in Minnesota, we amended our constitution and we created a dedicated source of funding for outdoor habitat, clean water, parks and trails, and arts and cultural heritage. And with that has come a great deal of legislative and legal requirements about understanding outcomes, articulating outcomes, and measuring outcomes. So it really has ramped up our efforts and our focus. At that time, we created what we call our 25-year framework. And I think Eric is going to put a link to that in the chat. We don't have a strategic plan. We haven't had a strategic plan for 25 years. We instead use our strategic framework to focus how we make decisions and what we're working on. And if you look at it, we've got a series of outcomes we're trying to achieve that are probably the same outcomes that are in your plans and in your guidance documents. But the big question is, how do we know if we're achieving those or not? How do we know if we have embedded the arts in daily life? How do we know if we have changed people's perceptions about the value of the arts? Those are pretty unmeasurable. So we created a set of indicators under those that we thought we could measure. We created a dashboard that's also on our website, and I know that Eric is going to post that as well. If you scroll all the way down to the bottom of the first page of our website, you can see our dashboard. It's pretty rudimentary looking, but it measures trends over time. And we have about 20 different indicators that we are measuring, a few of those each year, and reporting out to the public on what we think is the impact of our work. Fast forward to 2020, COVID changed a lot for all of us here in Minnesota. The murder of George Floyd also profoundly changed what we were doing. And like Illinois, we took advantage of that moment to eliminate 9 grant programs. We took the money out of those 9 grant programs, put them into 2 very, very flexible programs. And that really was our COVID funding for a few years. But we also at that time looked at our own grant making and discovered that there were disparities. Again, like Illinois, we aren't that far apart, Midwestern states. We are more purple than Illinois is, but we are a very purple state. And what we found is that there were 3 groups that were not faring as well in our grant making. And you've seen the list. It was BIPOC individuals and BIPOC-led organizations. It was Greater Minnesota, which in here means everything outside of our 7-county Minneapolis-St. Paul metropolitan area, and individuals with disabilities or groups, organizations that serve people with disabilities. So we named those as priority groups, and we have been tracking their success over time. We allocate dollars to those groups in our process, and what we have found is that in 2018, those groups were getting, maybe their success rates were in the 30 and 40% rate. Now we're in the mid to upper 70% rate. So it has made a big difference just to name them, and then also to allocate dollars to those groups. That's been one of our big initiatives. The other thing that we do, and I know that we have an advantage that many other colleagues on this call in this meeting don't have, and that is that we do have a full-time research director. Jeff Niblick is great. He's been with us now for about 3 years, and he leads several research projects, either things that we do internally or things that we commission others to do with and for us. So every year we are doing some sort of a survey asking Minnesotans what kind of arts experiences they are interested in. So far, those have not been town halls. They've been other kinds of methods, but that might be the next thing that we consider doing. We also, for the first time this past year, Jeff, did an analysis of where our public funding in the arts is going and came up with a per capita map. We have 87 counties in Minnesota, and we now know which of those counties are receiving how much money on a per capita basis. So that's going to give us direction for outreach. It's going to give us direction to say, are there arts activities there that we don't know about or they don't know about us? Or do we have to help build up arts activities that don't happen there at the moment? And then the last thing I'll talk about, we're in the process of this, so this is new for us. We are very focused on what are the public benefits that our funding produces. So how are young people better off? How are we helping build understanding across cultures, those sorts of things? All really big ideas, all really difficult to measure. So we're now asking our applicants to pick at least one of those public benefits that they think they are working on. We're going to track that, and we are working with an outside firm to build a toolkit to help them measure. So if they say they want to work on health and wellness, we'll try to build some tools for them to use to really evaluate whether they're doing that or not. This is all brand new. It's just getting started. Again, we'll post all of those things on our website once we have them, but I'm really excited about that. And we think that it's going to be a good benefit for us to, as we talk to legislators about the difference that funding is making. Understanding our impact and explaining our impact is our Moby Dick. Mine personally, we are always chasing it. We may never catch it. It may actually kill me at some point. But since we can't prove that the arts cause all of these good things, we're trying to measure perceptions, and we're trying to build a culture here in Minnesota that values evaluation and that understands that it's important to be able to talk about the difference and have evidence of the difference that we're making to the lives of Minnesota residents and communities. And I will stop there, and that will leave us some time for questions. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you so much, Sue. So the rest of our session will be devoted to some questions. I have a couple of prepared questions, and then Eric will ask a follow-up question. So my first question is a loaded question, and it's also my personal favorite as it's related to a lot of the work I do and have intimately been involved with at NASAA. But as I said, it's a bit of a loaded question. So to the panelists, please take whatever strand is the most meaningful to you and don't feel obligated to answer the whole question. But this question has to do with data and capacity, which go hand in hand. And in quantitative and qualitative equity analyses that assess grant making and the metrics which are used to carry the work forward, because there's also the carrying, not just engaging in the process, but what do you do after you assess the knowledge, you gather the knowledge. So in both of these, data is a major issue, both in understanding your own data and the limitation of the data that you collect, in understanding what data you need to collect, what are the other resources out there, the limitations there. And then there's also the qualitative data, going out into communities and understanding their needs and understanding the burden of data collection at the local level as well, at the grantee level. And all of that requires a lot of capacity. So if I could ask you each to briefly speak to the hurdles that you have faced in this process and continue to face, and some of the lessons learned. And as I said, you can take a strand. So I'll start with Illinois, please.
Yeah, I mean, I think you touched on it really well, on the fact that you know, one of the things that we've always done really well is the qualitative aspect of the research. I have program directors that are very open to long conversations with constituents, and that's where the majority of their time is actually spent. Though we weren't getting out into the field, we were doing a lot of hands-on work with our constituents, and people thought of us in a very kind of friendly manner. We always joke that we were the agency that said yes. It was a hard lift. There was already capacity issues within my staff, especially in the program side of things, managing all of the granting that we did do, because we do take upwards of 1,800 grants in a year. On top of all of that work, So in this redesign, one of the things that we knew that we wanted to do was to get the staff more out into the field, boots on the ground. I think California touched on this nicely about, not everybody is a 501c3 nonprofit model. Not everybody understands what it is to come to a state arts agency. And so we have to be out in the field, understand what's happening, meet with those groups, whether they be nonprofit 501c3s or not. And we have to shift our model to be able to serve that incredible work as well. But what I'm saying is that to ease the burden on my staff, we had to look at our grant making and go more towards basically compliance grant making as opposed to going to in-depth review. One nice thing is our general operating support grant is not competitive. We have a pool of money. If somebody is deemed that they are worthy of the money, they go into that pool. A formula determines what portion of it they get. So it's not competitive. So if we go to more of a compliance model, then it's taking the burden off of the staff of actually setting up panel meetings, reviewing everything, making sure that all of those panels have all the information that they need, preliminary review of all of those applications to make sure that they're worthy of going to the panel review process. Now it's basically, does your programming meet your mission? Do you meet all of the criteria that you have to meet in order to receive funds from the state of Illinois? You're good to go. You're in the pool. So we are truncating that entire process significantly, the workload for our staff, so that the majority of their time can be spent in the field, meeting with constituents and learning more about what needs to be done in this state.
Thank you
Does that
so
answer
much.
your question?
Yeah, I mean that, the massive question that was. Yes, thank
I
you.
just wanted to add one thing to that, and that is that in essence, the program directors went from becoming gatekeepers to gardeners in terms of how they're relating to our communities.
That's great. I love that. I love that. California, do you have anything to say about that massive question?
Absolutely. Thank you, Moja. And I love what you just said about gatekeepers to gardeners. I'm taking that note for sure. Yeah, I mean, Moja, if I may, I'd sort of like to respond to the question in two different ways, because when we're thinking about capacity, there's obviously the level that Josh just spoke to about our staff's capacity, right? And what we can actually, the numbers that we can crunch and the data that we can gather and then analyze and then respond to, right? Then there is also the capacity of our grantees and our community partners and what data we are asking them to collect. And our very wonderful equity data metrics and evaluation manager, Rebecca Ratskin, really talks about coming to those questions with equity-based data collection practices, right? So starting off with the question, what is it that we actually have to know? How are we expecting people to collect it? And are we going to actually use it? Because if the answer to that last question is no, we shouldn't be asking it in number one, right? And we shouldn't be asking our staff to do anything with it either. So when we're really getting down to at whatever organizational size, again, whether it's our state arts agencies or whether it's a grantee that we're asking to feed us back particular data sets, sort of starting from what it is that we really need to know from them and how they can get it to us. And then one other thing, Josh, that you just said that really resonated with me is when we're getting our staffs out in the field, right? The notion that we're often getting data that we may not even be recognizing as data, right? When we're having those one-on-one conversations, when we're getting an email from an applicant or a grantee, right? That this is data and how can we put sort of the low-hanging fruit mechanisms in place to be tracking and responding to that so we don't feel like we're continuing to need to start from scratch.
Great, thank you very much. Sue, do you have anything to add to the conversation?
Well, that was a massive set of questions,
Yes.
Moja. I'll say very quickly, I think that we are drowning in data. The legislature requires us to collect so much information about our applicants and grantees, most of it not really helpful in decision making. And the qualitative data that we get through our final reports or from grantees tends to talk about the impact on them as grantees. What we're trying to do is to get past that and say, what is the impact on the people that you are serving, on your audiences, on your students, on your participants? And that's the nut that we are trying to crack. I don't know if we ever will, but we're going to keep trying.
Thank you very much. And yes, I recognize the massiveness of the question. And I did want to plug some NASA resources in terms of some of the tools that we have available. So we have many data and mapping tools available to states where states can visualize and even play with their grant making data. So we invite anyone to contact us, contact anyone at the research department if you have any questions about these tools and would like to see a demonstration. So that is a resource available to everyone. So the next question that I would like to ask is, California touched upon this, and I would like to invite them to go first, but I'm phrasing this question as beyond dollars, but I think the question and the answer packs a punch. And so as California said, the budget that they receive is just a small portion of the needs of underserved communities. And I think every SAA faces that with the needs of the underserved community do not match the budgets that are received. So, but there are other ways that SAAs can work to reach underserved communities. And so my question is, how can SAAs leverage their resources to catalyze funding and advocacy? And I would like to start with California, please.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Moja. Yeah, again, as John articulated so brilliantly in his presentation, even if all of our dollars went directly to the most in need organizations, right, that would be very much a drop in the bucket. So a couple of things that I would highlight over and above, of course, the things that I know most, if not all of us engage in terms of partnerships and conversations with private funders in various mechanisms. One more recent mechanism that we have employed at the CAC is partnering with what we call AOs, administering organizations. And essentially our AO model is we make a grant to an organization, a local arts organization, that then re-grants those dollars in their local community. But over and above the dollar flow, those organizations are then tasked with offering professional development, capacity building, community convening in ways that our little staff of 27 in Sacramento can't possibly do in a state as massive as California. And so what we've really seen as we've started utilizing this administering organization mechanism is that over and above the impact of the dollars in the hands of local artists and arts organizations, they're receiving a lot more in terms of elevation of their work, visibility of their work, and capacity. And so it's expanding the impact of the actual dollars going out the door by getting local organizations involved in spreading those resources around. And as just one tiny example, in our California Creative Core program, which is our workforce development program that had 3-year funding from 2021, a quite significant investment. That AO model has gotten not only dollars in the hands of artists and organizations that have never even applied for the CAC. Many of them had never heard of the California Arts Council, but they have been able to provide resources not only to the sub-grantees, but to folks that applied and were not successful. And again, just sort of expanding what we're able to do in terms of those alongside resources and systems of support. We found that to be a really, really helpful mechanism for us.
Great, thank you so much. Sue, do you have something to add?
I'll just say one quick thing. In Minnesota, the State Arts Board exists, but we also have a series of 11 regional arts councils all around the state of Minnesota. And so a big part of what we do and what they do primarily is offer services as well as funding. And so training, capacity building, those sorts of things. We are in the process of starting to think about some additional capacity building that we can do here. So that's one side of it, which is the non-financial support. The other piece of it is that Minnesota is a geographically big state, but we're a small state. We tend to all know each other, and we regularly are in conversation with the primary foundations and arts funders in the state. In fact, we just had a meeting this morning and talk about what they're seeing, what we're seeing. And so there are ways that we can communicate about needs that maybe if we as a public funder are not able to meet, maybe a private funder could step in, or maybe a private funder has highlighted something that they're working on. So we try as much as possible to think about our work as being complementary to one another and cooperative or collaborative whenever it's possible. And I'm going to have to apologize. I was awful and I scheduled myself back to back. So I'm going to jump out and say thank you to everybody for being here, and great to see my colleagues. And I'm sorry to miss the end of the conversation, but I am going to jump off, everybody.
Thank you so much.
Thank
so
you.
So I'll turn it over to Josh and Eve. You have something to say? I know that you're just making all sorts of headway in your state.
Trying to, we talked a little bit about the Illinois Creative Collaborative, which is working with sister agencies. We found that, a good example is the Capital Development Board. They were giving out huge grants to artists, $250,000, some to build, public art in relation to the construction of a building. But the same 12 artists kept getting it because the only way that they were advertising it was on their website. No artist would think to go to the Capital Development Board to look for opportunities. So we've started partnering with them, sending that out to our constituents, and their applicant pool has grown significantly. Which is great. We're hoping to see more diversity in that kind of work. So that's happening. Similar to California and Minnesota, we have a pretty robust local arts network, we call them, which is local arts agencies throughout the state that we offer re-granting dollars to. And I think, Moshe, you touched a little bit on this, or maybe it was Josie, not really understanding the data that you have. And this is a great example. We've given large pools of money to these organizations to kind of create their own granting program and get in the nooks and the crannies of the state in a way that we can't. And yet we don't utilize their grantees as data points for ourselves in relation to reaching rural communities, which is just a ridiculous thing to not be doing. So we're working on that. Another thing we've been doing is identifying service organizations around the state, meeting with them as a group, because I think a lot of service organizations coming out of the pandemic all decided to go towards capacity building and professional development, and people are kind of doubling efforts. And so if we can have a conversation and make sure those resources are spread so that we're not seeing duplicated efforts, we can have a greater impact on the field. We've also been doing that with foundations as well, making sure that they're understanding the changes we make and seeing if there's anything we can do to support adjustments in the work that they're doing as well.
Great, that's wonderful. So I have about 4 minutes left, and then Eric's going to ask a question. So Josie, Joshua, John, E. With these 4 minutes, are there a couple of minutes worth of lessons learned that you would like to talk about? Just the kind of your favorite lessons learned or the most impactful lessons learned within the 4 minutes? We can start with Joshua. You're on my screen, big. So.
Sure. Yeah, I would say you know more than you think you do. I would say 75% of the data that we received, we were not surprised. It was good to have the data in hand so that we could make the argument and have data to back it up. But we already knew what the issues were. So it's just a matter of taking those baby steps forward, I would say. And really make sure you take the time to hear from all of your staff members to make sure that they understand the work that's being done and that there's buy-in, because when the entire team's excited, it's much more successful, I would say. E, anything else you want to say? You stuck on mute?
The only thing I would add is that it's when you're trying to provide holistic support for organizations or communities throughout the state, you really have to be holistic yourself. It's kind of like walking through the doors of perception, meaning that you don't know what you're going to find out there. But I will echo what Josh said. You kind of know what's out there, but by going out there to the communities and connecting, or by looking at your data, it informs you and affirms what you already know. So you're learning new things, but also affirming what you already know. So this work is really important, but it doesn't take dollars to do it necessarily. It does take time to do it. And if you dedicate your time in a holistic way and approach your staff in a holistic way to provide holistic support for communities, I think it goes a long way.
Thank you so much. This is poetic and it's applicable to our own lives as well. I really like these, these final thoughts. Josie and John?
Yeah, I'll toss this to John in just a second because I know it was a really fascinating point for both of us going through this work. But sort of as a complement to what Josh and you just said about you're affirming what you know, you're also learning all of these things that you still want to know more about. And for us, I know a key one was these 67% of nonprofit arts organizations in California that are operating with less than $50,000 a year. And we have so little information relatively about what they're doing versus the larger organizations. And so really trying to sort of think through next steps in terms of how do we engage to really find out how are we supporting them in terms of the needs that an organization of that size has versus a $10 million organization. So just the sort of continued opportunity to learn more. John, I don't know if there's anything you want to say about that.
I guess this conversation just brought to mind something that one of the interviewees said in I think it was in South LA, and there was definitely a certain sense of frustration in her voice when she said, I mean, why are they coming in here asking where the funds are going? They know where the funds are going. You already know that. Do they really have to come and be interviewing us about this? And I think on the one hand, yes, we do know that. We know a lot. We also need data to back that up in some instances, because we might know it, but other stakeholders or people that we need to communicate with might not take our word for it. But at the same time, I also think it's important just to kind of empower ourselves to kind of know what we already know. And I think, you know, perhaps even not every state has to spend hundreds of dollars repeating the research that another state next door did to demonstrate again what we already knew. Like I think that we can share our learning in a way that might be productive than kind of thinking that we have to start with a blank slate as if we didn't know anything going into this. So that's one point. And I think another thing that I learned was just the value of the networks within the arts community and communications within the arts community. As I said, in some communities, like tracking down the person who manages the community choir, that took like a day of work of kind of following up, figuring out oh, okay, it's used to be run by someone else, but now it's the teacher at the middle school who's now running that, and they don't have the contact information on the webpage, and you have to like call their neighbor and ask them to go next door and knock on and kind of ask them the question. And I found it after some of these conversations that I facilitated, people started emailing me who, like, I'm not even, you know, a part of the California Arts Council, but they'd be like, oh, someone's painting a mural, and I know that there are some muralists in our discussion group. Can you let them know about it? And I'd be like, sure, yeah, I have their email addresses, but like, I'm, you know, not in their community. I'm here in the Bay Area, not particularly connected to the CAC, and yet just having even just those email addresses kind of made a difference. And I think that that's something also that I'm continuing to think about, is kind of how do we strengthen the networks where the infrastructure is so thin in some instances.
If I can just echo that quickly, one thing that came out of this, and actually our theory of change, that was another of the grant making deliverables, was the notion of what would it be for the CAC to be the network of networks, and how do we lean into that?
Absolutely. Thank you. So your comments have been so valuable. Thank you. Thank you everyone so much. And with that, I am done, and I will pass it on to Eric, and we will wrap things up.
Thank you, Moshe, and thank you, Josie, E, John, Josh. I have one question that I got from the audience that I'd like to ask E and Josh before we dial out in a couple minutes. You mentioned that the disparity between rural communities and in Illinois, as well as like the more urban communities such as Chicago. And the question was really, are there more specific plans you could share as to how you're seeking to improve granting opportunities for those rural communities in comparison? Or are you still kind of like working and brainstorming that?
No, we actually have started implementing quite a few changes here, especially programmatic changes. Uh, our general operating support grant does still require a nonprofit 501c3 breakdown, but we created a project-based grant called the Creative Catalyst Grant, which is basically open for any project in any capacity, including curators. Therefore, we can see, as I have program directors that are going out into these rural areas, meeting with these different organizations, understanding leaders and things like that. If they're learning about incredible events that are happening by a grandmother in the basement of a church, we have a means to support that work now. And so basically just simplifying our application process, making it more open. It was as simple as that. And we're lucky in that not all of our grants have to follow that nonprofit 501c3 model, just our match from the NEA. And so we were able to make that happen. And then, of course, we support individual artists as well. So individuals can come in for work from all over the state.
We also integrated the equity points that we worked with into the GOS review process, meaning that BIPOC, underserved, and rural communities are going, the formula that we use for the criteria for that will benefit them at a higher rate than organizations that are not serving those types of communities. I did want to add one thing and just say that just encourage everyone on this meeting that to note that it's really a fertile time right now for innovation, creation, collaboration, partnerships, investigation. I just want to encourage everyone on this call to look at your programs and start being as creative as your communities, start inventing things. Of course, all within our required eligibility guidelines, etc. One thing that you could be very creative in is collecting that data information. One of the biggest shocks for me was to find out that over 40 years of information that the Arts Council had gathered was pretty much worthless. You can be innovative in terms of how you collect that information. You don't have to collect it in your application. You collect it in the final report. You can collect it in the information organizational area. And those all are legitimate ways of collecting that information. Before you do that, though, try to figure out what information you need to collect for your community and your state, because it's not the same all across the board, as we know. And then I just want to give a shout out to those state agencies in those states that are in areas that this kind of work is a little harder to do. And you just may have to be more creative in terms of how you do this work around equity.
Thank you, E. Thank you, Josh. And thanks again, John, Josie, Moshe, Ryan. This has been a great session, and I really appreciate it. Thank you for sticking around a couple minutes past.